The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
The original title of this course was American Television, A Cultural History, and you can take that to be the subtitle of the course today. The course title was changed to Understanding Television, in part to accommodate a colleague of mine who alternates teaching television with me at MIT. And when he teaches it in a more international perspective and in a somewhat more theoretical way, and pays less concrete attention to programming, to specific programs, than I will do in this course. One central feature of this course is that you must watch as much television as you can possibly bear, even more than you can possibly bear. And although we will every Wednesday night have assigned viewings, partly because a lot of television's history is not available any longer, the only way to make people know about it for sure is to try to give them at least a sampling of older television. So every Wednesday, probably won't be a 3-hour session, but every Wednesday for 2 or 2.5 hours, we will show you texts, videotapes of programs from television's past. And we'll move chronologically, so eventually we'll get up closer to the present time. We will probably end with some programs that are actually on the air now, programs like The Sopranos or 6 Feet Under showing on HBO, perhaps a show like The West Wing, which is on one of the networks. But most of what you will see in these viewings is material that is unavailable, not even on Nick at Night. It is unavailable in reruns, and it's the only way to give you at least a partial sense of the historical matter with which the course is concerned. But in addition to those viewings, to those Wednesday night viewings, my hope and my expectation is that you will all watch a lot of television. I think that you watch old television. That is to say, if you can get Nick at Night and you can watch older television programs, that's the ideal. Or if you can watch reruns at whatever weird hour you happen to be awake, that's the ideal. In other words, try to expand your sense, and even watch programs that maybe you never watched when you were younger because you weren't interested in that particular genre or category or performer. To get a sense, as much as you can, to fill in a sense of what was on television, what television programs from the past were like. One of the unique aspects of television, especially in the United States, and it's actually, I think, now becoming a kind of global phenomenon, is that the medium has a unique power, an utterly unique power, to keep its own history in some fragmented form constantly before its audiences. Because the movie audiences that went to the theaters in 1945 or 1950 were not able, when they went to the theater, to see movies from the 30s. Those movies existed only in memory, and there were no university courses in movies either. There weren't even any archives or libraries that saved movies during the period when movies were actually an important cultural force in the United States. In a certain sense, that's one of the ways in which we can say that television has as a mechanism, or as a social technology, as a social formation, has an even greater power than the movies, because it has this extraordinary power not only to renew itself, but to make its contemporary audience in some degree familiar with its history. And a channel like Nick at Night, of course, makes this explicit. Nick at Night trades on the fact that it is the channel of television history. And sometimes it even has parody figures who I sometimes fear are actually literally parodies of me. Because I was one of the very first professors to teach this stuff in universities. And sometimes, some of you may have seen this, Nick at Night has a very proper-looking, gray-suited professor who says, "Now, let me tell you about the psychological implications of I Love Lucy." And it always makes me uncomfortable when I see that, because I actually do that. And in fact, students of mine have worked at Nick at Night, and so I know at some level that there's a sort of an awareness of the idea that the study of television is still, although it's becoming more respectable, is still in some sense thought to be a kind of weird or a strange activity. So there's a double parody, not only of professors who teach television, but of the very idea that television has made its way into the classroom, has made its way into the museum, is now becoming a part of the culture that we study and talk about. And that process, whereby the daily experience of ordinary people is suddenly transformed into an artifact, moves into a museum, is something we'll be talking about a bit in this course, and it's something I talk about in one of the essays that I'm going to have you read within a couple of weeks. It's the essay titled Television as an Aesthetic Medium. And in that essay, I begin by talking about the process whereby artifacts of all kinds have many lives, and the way in which these cultural artifacts, they're often cultural practices that are transformed by time and by technological change into something else. Well, we live in a moment, and this is an exciting moment to be studying and thinking about television. We live in a moment when that is literally happening to television, and some of you are surely aware of this. There are now museums that specialize in television. One of them is in New York, called the Museum of Broadcasting, right? There are now award ceremonies for television programs that, while they don't match the Oscars in terms of audience interest, they've gotten beyond simply being a kind of industry experience, or experience just for the folks who work in the industry, and have become something of a cultural phenomenon in their own right. Audiences, the population at large is interested in what program is chosen to be the best drama series of the year, or what actor or actress is chosen to be the best soap opera actress. And there's a famous actress who was a runner-up 10 years in a row, and she actually became famous for never winning. Anyone know her name? Yes, yes. You see, that the fact that so many of you know the answer to that is also proof of something else, and why it's an interesting and very challenging experience to teach television. The answer, the reason is, the implication of the fact that so many of you knew the answer to that question is that television is actually still a part of the living culture of the society. Although it's undergoing profound transformations now, it's part of the actual lived experience of all of you. All of you have actually had an unmediated and ordinary and usually a continual experience of television from your earliest days. In fact, I myself belong to the last American generation to have been born before the advent of television. Television came into my life when I was just before I was a teenager. I actually have a memory of American culture before television, and I was shaped much more by books than I was by television. I belong to the last American generation for whom that's true, and it gives me a unique perspective on television. One reason it gives me a unique perspective is that the whole history of television is part of my life. I remember when televisions cost a fortune, and when there were virtually no programs on television, and some of the younger television scholars who belong to younger who belong to younger generations than I have a different perspective and a different set of attitudes about the medium, in part because their life experiences are different from mine. In any case, to come back to the major point that I had meant to make a minute ago, we live in a moment now of profound transformation in many ways. One of the most decisive instances of the way our culture is changing has to do with the way in which television is changing, the way in which the history, the past of television is suddenly being recovered as something valuable and important for the first time. There's this recognition that what my parents' generation regarded as the utter garbage of our society is now being tracked by scholars and saved in museums, and there are festivals of programs that my parents would have refused to allow me to watch when I was a child, right? This is a very interesting phenomenon. It's not the first time it's happened. It's a recurring feature of cultural life that cultural forms and cultural experiences undergo a kind of transformation in which their valuation, the way in which they're actually valued and understood by a society, is powerfully altered. There was a time, not even that long ago, when movies were regarded with a kind of contempt by educated people that is unimaginable today. When I was a student in university, there were no college courses in film, and the notion that you might actually have a curriculum in film or grant degrees in film study would have struck my professors as the height of absurdity, as a kind of vulgarity that they would find unbearable and shocking. Right? But of course, movies are now not just a respectable form of American expression recognized very widely as a powerful expressive art form, as the decisive art form of the 20th century. But no one is surprised or unhappy about the fact that there are university courses in movies. Well, television is now undergoing, is at the beginning of that process of museumization, right? It's entering the museum. It's becoming an object of contemplation. It's becoming an object, not that it wasn't always this, but potentially this. I mean, in other words, the programs themselves haven't, in that sense, changed their fundamental character, but our way of understanding those programs has undergone a change. And the kind of affection that some of you felt for Susan Lucci is an example of that. That is, part of what grants power, resonance, authority to television programs are the life experiences people associate with them. So the cult audiences for the Brady Bunch, for example, are not always or even primarily audiences that value the artistic power of the Brady Bunch. What they value instead is their memory of having grown through their early adolescence by measuring their lives against the lives of the Bradys. Well, cultural forms of storytelling that implicate themselves in the lives of a population, in the lives of ordinary people, so deeply and powerfully, are worth studying, even if they have no other claim on our attention. One of the ambitions of this course is to make you aware of television in what we might call this anthropological and sociological dimension, to make you aware of the extent to which the power of the medium to become a part of the daily habitual experiences of American lives is at the heart of its power, and why that power is so rare and so extraordinary. And so that's one fundamental aspect of what we want to do in the course. And of course, what we also are going to be doing then is studying the ways in which this medium has altered, evolved, developed over now something like 50 years. Its development and its transformation has many lessons for us. It is intrinsically interesting, that development, that evolution, that history is intrinsically interesting, and I hope to show you why that's true, and expose you to some of the pleasures of historical, in a way, of original historical research. Parenthesis. One other exciting thing about studying television is that at one level it's contemporary, another level it is a historical artifact, but almost all the work that you might be doing on specific programs in this course can be understood to be a form of original historical research, because television scholarship is still in some respects in its infancy. I mean, there's a lot of very bad stuff that's been done in the last 10 or 15 years as it's actually become an academic field, and young faculty members have discovered they can credentialize themselves and earn promotions by writing about the Brady Bunch. But most of that work is going to be forgotten in 50 years, and it is actually likely, especially the graduate students in this course, but even some of the undergraduates in this course, are very probably, or at least, I don't want to promise this, but are very likely to do work that will last. The papers you write in this course might actually be publishable, might actually be a contribution to the historical understanding of our society, because if you're working on programs that no one has worked on before, or if you see them in a light that hasn't been shown on them before, you'll be saying valuable things. And there actually are places in which the work of graduates and undergraduates on television programs can be published. And I've actually been toying with the idea of making up some sort of a course journal of some sort. Maybe we'll put up a website in which the very best writing in the course is put up on the web. And those of you who are interested in this as an idea, talk to me about it. I'll need some volunteers to help set up the site, but we have the technology at MIT, and if you're interested, I'd be glad to direct such a thing. I do have a collection of the best essays written in this course over the years, both here when I've taught the course here and when I've taught it at the University of Illinois as a visitor. I will make that available to those of you who are interested. It's a kind of anthology of the strongest essays in the past written by students who have taken this course. And I've toyed with the idea of publishing it. I think it's actually become more interesting over time, because some of the students who wrote about television programs 15 years ago had a very different sense of what they were doing than students today do. So these collections of student papers have taken on a historical character that I think is interesting. And I will put a collection of them on reserve in the reserve book room for this course. So one fundamental aspect of this course is a historical one. But it's historical in this strange way because it's what we're dealing with is a historical phenomenon that is also at the same time alive and contemporary and is undergoing continued transformations as it continues. So it's a part of our lives, but it's also distant from us, and that's part of what makes the study of television so interesting. Everyone's filled out a card. Would you pass them to the left and then to the front? And when you get them, what's your name? Erin? Erin, when you get them, would you alphabetize them for me? Thank you. And what's the number, Farhad? Have you done the count yet? 26. Okay. How many of you are graduate students? How many are graduate students? 2, 4, 5. I'd like to meet with the graduate students after class briefly to talk about certain special obligations you'll have if you continue, as I hope you will, in the course. Now, let me say a few things about the syllabus itself, and then turn to some other matters. Everyone has these two sheets. The first sheet says required text, and it's a list of, in two categories of secondary sources. And then the second sheet is the schedule of classes and topics. Let me make a quick comment about the. Does everyone have copies of this? I know there are enough around, so let's make sure everyone has them. And then again, folks, if there are additional copies, please save them for me so I can hang on to them for students who may add the course or for later purposes. So page 1, required text. There are 3 texts that I've required you to buy in the course. One is what still remains in a way the only real history of television. It has its limitations, but it's still the best book of its kind. And its bare bones history, especially of the economic structures of television, remains unsurpassed. It's Eric Barnow's book, Tube of Plenty. And over the course of the term, you'll end up reading most of this book, if not all of it, as our kind of skeletal history, although it's not a fully adequate history at all. Barnow was himself belonged to a generation that regarded television in a very negative light, and his inability to see television in more complex ways colors his treatment of the material. He's not very respectful toward the audiovisual complexity of television, even of early television. So there are limits to the book, but you'll recognize those limits easily, and there are ways we can compensate for that limitation. It's also a healthy and valuable thing to be reminded that books don't always speak a perfect truth, that they are imperfect and partial objects, even when they're written by your professors. The second book is Brooks and Marsh's Directory of Primetime Television Programs. Many of you probably have this book or have had earlier editions of it. You must buy the latest edition, and you must use it as your Bible in the course. There are limitations in this book, too, which we will talk about. Its descriptions of courses, of programs, is often inadequate, limited, silly in some ways. It tends to be obsessed by plot and very rarely captures very much of the atmosphere or texture of a program. The length of its entries is often all out of proportion to the relative importance of its program, of the programs it describes. So it has profound limitations. But with each new edition, the book has gotten richer and more complex, partly because it's listed more and more programs, and it remains a fundamental research tool, a fundamental resource for anyone interested in television. It's also a wonderfully fun book just to leaf through and and at the back of the book there is a list of the primetime schedule, the way programs were displayed to the original primetime audiences beginning in the late 40s and running right through, I think, 1998. We will be looking at that and learning from that as the course goes on, and I hope many of you will read around in this book on your own. Every single show that we talk about or that we view in our viewing session, of course I would want you to read the description of. But my hope is that you'll read the description of many, many other programs as well, and that they will help guide the specific kinds of research that you do. My hope is that, well, I won't require everyone to bring this book to class every day, but I'm going to count on the idea that there'll be someone in the class who has this book, because very often when we're talking about television, a show that seems worth mentioning will occur to me, and I'll want to remember its exact dates. I can usually come very close. I know the dates of many, many programs. Of course, I've been studying the medium and watching it all my life, but the medium is too rich in terms of simply the number of programs that have been on for any one person to have mastered that. So we need the book as a kind of helpful instrument, even in our individual classes. So I'm counting on some of you always having this book in class. So when we say, oh, what were the years of the Brady Bunch? Can anyone answer without looking? I think that's not a bad guess. I think it starts in the late 60s, but I think it runs for a longer time. Check. And there is other useful information in the back of the book that, as you will see when you begin to use it. You'll need it for the writing of papers and so forth in the course in any case. And the final book is the standard anthology of television, of writing about television, edited by Horace Newcomb, late of the University of Texas, now at the University of Georgia, the director of, just recently appointed the director of the Peabody Television Awards. And this book is in its 6th edition. In some ways, the 6th edition seems to me less interesting than the 4th and 5th editions, and I'm going to put all the editions of this book on reserve. I think there's a publishing impetus behind this. I mean, if the book changes its contents very frequently, it has to be repurchased all the time, and the older editions are thought to be out of date. In this case, though, the writing about television has undergone such a transformation in the past decade that it's also understandable why Newcomb would want to try to get more recent texts. There are a couple of essays that remain standard about the history of television, about the nature of television, and they have not changed. There are, I think, 2 or 3 essays in the book that have been in every edition, maybe every edition except the first. And one of them, the most luminous essay, I think, in the book is by me. And Newcomb has written beautifully, a beautiful tribute to that essay. It means a lot to me because Newcomb is a much more prolific scholar of television than I am. And he once wrote several paragraphs about the importance of that essay. It's an essay that I'm going to have you read at some point. I think it's on the syllabus. It's called Television Melodrama. And it's been in every edition. And one reason I'm proud of it is that almost everything else in the book has changed in the course of the number of editions it's gone through. But it's a useful book, and we will read a certain proportion of that as required reading. And then many of you will find other essays in the Newcomb anthology useful depending on the specific kind of work you choose to do in your writing. So 3 required texts, and then depending on your work, many of the books that I've listed as recommended works ought to be useful to you. But I didn't want to specify which, because it will partly depend on what some of you are interested in. And another wonderful thing about this course is that it allows students to pursue special interests of their own. If you're preoccupied by the treatment of race on television, for example, which is a very rich and interesting subject, of course, because it mirrors in some respects, the attitudes toward race in the second half of the 20th century in our country, there are specific texts or books in that list that you might be more interested in than others. If you're interested in the treatment of family life or in the treatment of gender on television, there are other texts that I might send you to. But I've offered you this list partly as a way of showing you that television, the field of television study, is now really a field. This is not at all a complete list of all the possibly relevant materials that we might actually look at, but it is a list of works that I have at least some respect for. In many cases, a great deal of respect for. And there's no book on this list that I think is without some real value, and many of them are very important and central to our study of television. There are a couple of texts on the list that are not about television that have a kind of larger interest for me. One of the most important is a book called The Practice of Everyday Life by Michel de Certeau. Many of you may know that from your own reading, but it's a partly theoretical book and a partly ideologically. It's a book that's attuned to the ideological implications of ordinary life, and it has a profound relevance to the study of television. A second book that I think is tremendously important for the analogies it offers us is a book not very widely known, but one of the great works of scholarship of the modern era, Peter Burke's Popular Culture in Early Modern Europe. And I'm going to probably ask the graduate students to read in those two books as part of their additional required work, but I hope any undergraduate in the course who's interested in these questions certainly might want to consult them. Finally, well, not finally, next to it, finally but one, the collection of essays by Roland Barthes called Mythologies has had a profound impact on my own thinking about popular culture, and at least one of those essays we'll actually read and discuss as a group. But I think this Roland Barthes, of course, is a very influential, mainly theoretical writer about culture. I myself think these relatively modest essays collected in his book called Mythologies are Roland Barthes at his most remarkable. And I think the essays there are often much more, not only are they more accessible, I think they're often more nuanced and intelligent than the more heavy-handed and extended theoretical essays that he wrote later in his career. And it's impossible to overestimate the influence that Roland Barthes has had on the study of popular culture in the United States. And the healthiest part of that influence comes from that book called Mythologies. Finally, the book probably more than any other that's influenced my own sense of cultural study and cultural interpretation, Clifford Geertz, the founding anthropologist whose book is called The Interpretation of Cultures, he's written other books too, but that's for me the key book. And there are two essays in that book that are especially important. I haven't decided whether to require the whole class to read it. Some of you will certainly have to read it depending on the kind of project you pick up on. I certainly recommend this to the graduate students as one of the seminal books about interpretation and culture of the last 50 years. Let me turn very quickly to the schedule of classes and topics. The reason that the syllabus is somewhat incomplete, and that I've actually only given you the readings for the first 3 weeks, is that I wanted a little more time to think about how to handle the problem of the fact that television as a phenomenon has been growing at both ends. In other words, we've been recovering more and more of television's past, and more programs from the early days of television are being recovered. Some of them were broadcast live, and we thought, well, they just went out into the ether, but it turns out that even many of the programs that were broadcast live were recorded in some form. They had a system called kinescoping. Essentially, they put a movie camera in front of a television screen, and while the program was being broadcast, the camera recorded it. And it's turning out that there are archives or private collections that are showing up every day in something of the way that the history of silent film is expanding in a similar sense. People are going into the garages of old film scholars or script writers or of old directors, and they're discovering films that we thought were lost. The same thing is beginning to happen to the history of television, so that one of the things that's happening is that shows from the early 40s and the 50s, many of which were broadcast live, records of those, versions of those are starting to show up. And of course, at the other end, at its contemporary moment, television is expanding at an exponential rate. There are more networks, more programs, more of television that's produced from abroad is available to us for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about a bit as the course goes on. And so the complexity of this problem is something that has given me some pause, and I wanted to give some thought to how to handle the question. One way I've decided to control the subject matter is already implicit in what I've been saying. Although television is a medium for many kinds of expressions, in this course we're going to center on storytelling, on its fiction programming. And even more narrowly than that, we're going to center on its primetime programming. I won't forbid people to talk about soap opera, and soap operas are relevant and one of the most powerful and interesting fictional forms on television, and students in the class who wish to pursue projects about daytime fiction programming are encouraged to do so, but in our main discourse, in our class itself, and in our required viewing, we're going to stick to primetime fiction. But I don't say we're going to stick to it exclusively. We will at various moments deviate from our primary interest to say at least a few things about various forms of news broadcasting and how that has evolved. And you certainly should feel free to pursue an interest of that sort in your own research in the course. If you'd rather write a paper about news, we can talk about that, and you're certainly encouraged to do it. You can write essays and do research on the commercial aspect of television if you wish to. One of the students who took this course here at MIT some 15 or so years ago is now the president of an advertising agency in Boston, and has sent me commercials that a kind of mini archive of commercials going back to the 1950s, and we may take a look at some of those in the course of our investigations. Yes. His name is Fred Ekdom. I also, a couple of years ago, had a student in the course whose father was in a New York advertising agency, and he conned his father into giving us a number of commercials. And so we have an archive of interesting commercials that people might want to look at. So in other words, I'm not foreclosing your own pursuit of interest that you may have concerning aspects of television that we won't center on in the course, but there are several very powerful justifications for limiting our investigations primarily to fiction. The first is that it's the most important and powerful and influential form of television. It's what most people watch. Recently, there have been some minor changes in that with what is called, quote, reality television. But the primetime schedules today are freer of fiction than they've ever been. There's less fiction on television now. There are fewer primetime series than ever in the medium's history. My own suspicion is that it's a momentary and temporary phenomenon that we will go back to storytelling. Every culture tells stories to itself. Every culture has a variety of institutions whose function is to tell stories, is to narrate a kind of continual version of itself to itself. And television played that role in American society has played that role in American society for over 50 years. That's one justification for looking at its stories. Its stories have been what most people have watched. The largest number of people have spent the most hours watching its stories. Right? The title of my magnum opus unpublished magnum opus on television is Story Machine. It was a machine for telling stories. And it perfected certain strategies for the mass production of stories that it inherited from the movies that made it the most astonishing machine for storytelling in the history of the world. And there's an appetite for stories in populations that television served. So that's one justification. The second justification has to do with who I am. I'm a person who I study literature. And I regard, although I'm interested and recognize the importance of the anthropological and sociological and political and ideological dimensions of television, they're in some ways more important than the aesthetic. I'm still interested in the stories as aesthetic objects. And I'm especially interested in that miraculous, surprising, always astonishing process whereby relatively minor, relatively trivial, relatively undeveloped kinds of materials over the course of time are transformed into something more and more complex, something more and more rich. I'm interested in the process whereby artifacts are transformed into works of art, whereby simple narratives become complex narratives. And again in this course, we're going to return to that phenomenon, to an interest in that phenomenon, and one of the wonderful things about studying television is that you can actually study this process. You can watch by studying the evolution of television genres, a process of complication in which the stories not only become more responsive to the complexities of the outer society and become more layered and resonant and complex simply as audiovisual objects, but you can actually see these programs' notions of what character is and what the relationships among characters might be deepening and complicating over time. In other words, you can, in a way, what what fascinates me most of all about television, even though I would hardly say, I would not want to say this is the only thing we're going to talk about, but it's going to be one central concern in the course, is this amazing process whereby we can study what I'll call the enabling conditions of art. Right? The enabling conditions of art. Now, let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean to sort of clarify more fully something of the excitement of this kind of process and how we're going to be able to look at it in this course. I'm going to show you something some of you will I hope recognize if the system works for me. It doesn't seem to be working. Let me see. Maybe now. Now, everything was working perfectly when I did the test this morning. Yeah, there we go. Now, let's see. Who's that? Who's Fred Ott? Who's Fred Ott? He's an incredibly important historical figure, and you've never heard of him. I'm kidding. But now, I hope you'll never forget about who Fred Ott is. Now, how did that zoom by itself? I'm supposed to control the zoom. There'll be some glitches here, folks, but we're going to look at a clip in a moment. Okay, so what this is a still version of a movie, right? But by tradition, it's the first movie. No one knows what the really first movie is. But at some point in 1895 or 1896, in East Orange, New Jersey, in the studio called the Black Maria, where Thomas Edison was experimenting with the apparatus that was going to become the motion picture, they had many false starts, and Fred Ott was one of Edison's employees, and they finally thought they had got it right, and they said, "Okay, Fred, do something," and they put the camera on him, and Fred took snuff and sneezed. And what we're looking at is a still version of that, right? Fred put snuff in his nose, and he went, "Achoo!" And they made some people call it the first movie. Well, it was incredibly exciting because it captured motion, right? And it's a way of reminding us of how primitive the earliest films were. Let me show you, if I can, an even more decisive instance of this, if I have the right clip, that I may show in my film course this afternoon as well, if I can get the technology working properly. Now I want VCR. Watch this. There should be sound here, but let's see if I can get it. Close to Fred Ott sneeze. Why? Same, not only a piece of art, but what specific art? Very right. Yes. So we have this extraordinary new technology, right? How is it imagined? It's imagined through the uses of old forms of representation, even when those forms of representation are in many ways fundamentally inimical to the inherent or fundamental features of the new form. I mean, one of the most fundamental things about the movie camera is its mobility. What do we see there, right? Not just that the audio, and of course the earliest cameras, the earliest cameras were placed as if they were characters sitting in an audience, and the actors walked in front of the camera. Why? What we saw probably suggests visual art, right? But when the actors walk in front of the camera, another older form of representation is the theater, right? So that theatrical and painterly models controlled the way in which the new technology was first understood, even when that technology inherently, intrinsically, had nothing whatever to do with the immobility that is associated with the stable position of the theater audience, or with the framed still image of that we see when we go into a museum and look at a painting. So one thing that we recognize here is that in its earliest stages, a new technology, especially when it's used for representations, although not only for representation, and it's true of all technology, will be understood through the lenses, through the metaphors that have defined the way we've understood representation earlier. And this process is something we're going to really be looking at closely when we look at the earliest television. We're going to watch a process whereby television fiction imagines itself first as forms of radio, forms of movies, forms of journalism, and in a process of partly just sort of hit and miss in a kind of experimental mode, begins to discover certain features that are unique or special to television. Very quickly, what would be, and remember, we're not necessarily talking about things that are always necessarily inherent in the technology itself. They could be inherent in what we might call the environment that grows up around the technology and that constrains it and shapes it just as much as its technical features. So what's one of the most obvious ways in which television is different from the movies, say, or from the theater? You watch it in a domestic space. Yes, you watch it at home. And what else that follows from that, about your relation to it? You can watch it alone, or you can watch it with other people, but I'm thinking of something else. I mean, you're about having to do with your access to it. It's ubiquity is what I'm thinking about. The fact is, when you go to the theater, you leave the house, you get a babysitter or whatever, you go and you sit in the theater. It's a major production. The same when you go to the movies. When television is there, and in fact, once they begin to proliferate, when they have television, when televisions become less expensive, and we begin to have televisions in the living room and in the kitchen and in the bedroom, other things begin to happen as well. So that the earliest televisions were situated like radios in the family living room, and they were watched by the whole family, right? Well, that environment constrained it in certain ways, and as televisions begin to proliferate into other rooms, and as we become multi-television homes, that changes the nature of television. You can think about what happens at that moment. It's fairly obvious what begins to happen is you begin to get what, after the advent of cable and satellite broadcasting, becomes an obvious norm, but actually begins to occur much earlier. Television programs begin to target specific audiences: children, women, adult, men, that kind of thing. Whereas in the beginning, they have to go to the whole family. But even more than that, even more fundamental than that, is the ubiquity of television. The fact that it's in your house, that you can watch it while you're making dinner if you want, that you can eat your dinner while you're watching it, that you can watch it in a way that it's a much less demanding, even though it's in your house, it's a much less demanding and imperial experience than going to the theater or going to the movies, right? In the early days of television, one of the things we constantly heard from the naysayers was how contemptible it was, and some of this contempt spilled over to the stupid audience that was so dumb it didn't know any better, that television began to create variations on I Love Lucy and the cop show Dragnet instead of Shakespeare, right? And this was thought, well, this was proof that television was an incredibly debased medium. What was it really proof of? That the mass audience, the so-called mass audience, actually was responding to elements that were intrinsic to television. If instead of being a blockbuster, unique experience that has to be memorable for the rest of your life, what happens when you go to the theater, television presents you with a continual connection to it. And what follows from that are smalling down, domestic stories, ordinary life, and especially serialization. Of course, I Love Lucy was more popular than the forms of televised theater that belong to what is wrongly called the so-called golden age of live television. It wasn't a golden age at all. It was a stupid misdirection. The golden age of live television was a version of that damn family, right? Movies as a form of visual art, movies as a form of painting. Now, I don't mean to make fun of it, because remember, every medium has to go through a process of self-discovery when it at first imitates and tries out the apparatuses and perspectives and formations of its ancestors. And that process we're going to be talking about in much more systematic ways as we go on in the course. And if I have time, as I think I will, I'm going to show you a very dramatic example of this in the history of television in a moment. Let's say one more thing about that damn family. which I only came across the other day, but it illustrates the argument so wonderfully well, even better than Fred Ott does. What I think. Tell me your name. Robin. What Robin said a minute ago was the most crucial thing. That what's decisive about that damn family is the way in which it understands itself as a form of painting, and accepts the restrictions of painting in a way that's not intrinsic to the nature of the medium. And that's proof that it's a very early film. But there's something else about it that's almost equally revealing. I mean, there's a kind of joke in it. It's so obvious that. It's not a very visually interesting experience, although from this distance in time there is a new kind of historical interest. Well, they wore funny hats. Look at the funny hairdos they had, so that it becomes a historical artifact in another sense as time passes. But what about the pun in the title of it? That damn, it's a family named Dam, D-A-M, right? But of course, it's the late. Remember, movies emerged in the late Victorian period when any kind of risque language was very shocking, right? So the appeal of the text in part depends on something that's verbal, right? It's dependent on a verbal medium, right? It's the pun on damn that really explains part of the appeal of this thing. And again, that has nothing to do with movies. It's, in fact, you could close your eyes. There's no visual aspect. What's creative about that damn family has almost nothing to do with the visual character of movies. It's connected to ideas about painting, connected to ideas about family portraiture, and connected to ideas about language. It depends on a kind of pun. Here's that damn cook. Here's that damn dog, right? And it's harder for us to recover it because we live in such a debased age that people saying damn is no longer shocking, doesn't send a quiver through everyone. But in 1897 or 1902, when this movie was made, to say damn in public was to say something kind of shocking. Yes. Yes. Although vaudeville was more raucous, but yes, you're right, of course. And again, it's drawing on an older form of entertainment for its understanding of what it is. Now, it's very obvious to us when we look at something like That Damn Family or Fred Ott Sneeze that the inherent qualities of the visual medium that is about to be born are not yet understood. But it's important to recognize that it's a process that every medium goes through. And when we talk, and in much subtler and more systematic and concrete ways, these are the kinds of questions I want us to be asking, in part, about the emergent medium of television. I'm going to show you a version of that in a moment that will have very great resonance, I think, and will also illustrate the profound political or ideological import of some of these questions. But before I do that, I want to show you, I'm maybe doing too much in one day, but I want to show you how deep this process is, how far back this process of imitation of ancestor worship by a new medium goes, and how we can see it. And you'll just as a way of illustrating. Now, can you see? I don't remember where I am here. That's probably a little too much. Let's zoom out. Can you see what this is? It's a page from an illustrated manuscript from the late Middle Ages. And it was a very highly evolved art form in the late Middle Ages. It's a page from a manuscript of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. In fact, some people take this to be a representation. This is a representation of one of the pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales. And these illuminated manuscripts were among the great and most astonishing artistic achievements of the late Middle Ages. This was all done by hand, and all of this is hand-drawn. This is an illustration taken from a brochure published by the Huntington Library. In other words, so we're talking about a manuscript culture in which the illustrations in the books were all done by hand illustrators who were very highly regarded artists. And in fact, in the late Middle Ages, there was an elaborate, it mostly belonged to the high culture, there was an elaborate system whereby books which were very expensive were sold to the wealthiest, to the aristocrats, to royalty, done by people who were regarded as among the most revered artists of the time, these illustrators. Now, of course, this is the moment in which the printing press is born. And I'm now going to show you a page from the Gutenberg Bible, the very first printed book, published around 1455, simultaneous with the Chaucer. And now, and what's astounding about it, I mean, there are many things that are astounding about it, but what's really interesting about that page is if you look at the bottom of the page, you can't see it very well in this reproduction, but you can see it well enough to get an idea of what it was like. That illustration in the left, on the right-hand folio, even though the book was printed on a printing press, was done by a hand illustrator. They hired illustrators who did the illuminated manuscripts of the time to come in after the book was printed on Gutenberg's press to do these hand illustrations. And in fact, for an extended period, more than 100-odd years after the advent of the printing press, the illuminated manuscript, the illuminated book, retained its cultural prestige, continued to be produced by the society. But for our purposes, the most astonishing thing about, from a technical standpoint, technological standpoint, about this hand illustration is how counterproductive it is from a technological standpoint. What is the point of having a printing press if every single book you print on the printing press has to be taken over to a hand illustrator and illustrate? On the other hand, you can understand why this was true. The culture understood books in a particular way. They were individuated objects. Even though there was a new way of producing the lettering, it didn't occur to them that, wait a minute, there might be, the longer-term implications of this are, we really don't want hand artisans. We don't want the book to be an artisanal object, because that will undermine one of the most fundamental features, one of the most powerful and central features of this new technology. And in fact, of course, as we know, the history of the Reformation, the history of the Renaissance is intimately connected to the fact that as they began to discover the power that came from the fact that you could distribute books widely, and what occurred was a cultural transformation, really the birth of what many people would call our modern world comes from that. But it strikes me as an enormously poignant and revealing fact that the very first printed book was so deeply rooted in an artisanal, illuminated manuscript culture that even though the technology of the printing press is available, they're not really ready to exploit it in anything like its actual potential. And let me show you the final, most dramatic example. Why I call this principle more than any other the horseless buggy principle. There's nothing inherent in the nature of the internal combustion engine to require that the first automobiles should resemble horseless carriages. Right? That fact owes its life to our inherited notions of transportation, to the metaphors and models through which we understood transportation, to centuries of wagons and horse-drawn buggies and palanquins, right? To centuries of forms of transportation that precede the internal combustion engine. And in fact, I'll move it up a little bit. You can see a kind of evolution. I'll show you you can see how the evolution occurs. This used to be a favorite kind of strategy in books extolling the powers of technology. Was to juxtapose, in the way that Neanderthal man evolves into modern man, so the horseless buggy inevitably transmogrifies itself into this remarkable modern engine. Well, all of these are illustrations of the same basic point, and we can call it the horseless buggy principle, or we might want to call it the Fred-Ott principle, which is another term I like to use for it, partly because if we talk about the Fred-Ott principle, it can remind us of the astonishing distance between Fred-Ott's sneeze on the one hand and something less than a quarter of a century later, or about a quarter of a century later, Chaplin's The Gold Rush, or Buster Keaton's The General. Highly complex, elaborated narrative art in less than 30 years, from something as simple as That Damn Family or Fred-Ott Sneeze. Well, let's now turn in a more specific way in the 20 minutes I have left to a television version of this. And I want to show you a fragment of a very influential and well-known television program and have a discussion with you to conclude the rest of our class today. Why isn't this working here? Oh, here we go. But now I can't, how do I get this back? Oh, there we go. Let's go back to the beginning. Loss of video. Come on. Be patient, folks. I don't think this is my fault, but it could be that I've been pressing the wrong. I don't think so. I didn't mean to let the whole thing run, but I was thinking about what I wanted to say, and I lost track of what I promised. Talk to me about what you saw there. Just that opening. What does that introduction signify? Yes, who are you? Say again, Lily? Lily. Right. Now, why is that? That's exactly right. That's one of the most important things about it. Why would they do that? What is signify? What are some of the implications of that? Yes. Yes, you're right. Elaborate that. I think that's exactly right.
Books have, or at least this one, books have always been a part of intellectual experience. People can be usually typically smarter, and books are just respected
Right.
more than big homes.
Oh, right. So it's right. I mean, so the point would be that it's a cultural form, the older cultural form, which has much more prestige and respect in the society, is invoked to try to, by association, create a kind of respect for the new form. That's right. That's a part of it. Yes. What else? Yes. Yes. So there's an element of trying to give you a kind of familiar. Here's a new medium, but let's surround the new medium with all kinds of signals of comfort, of familiarity, so that maybe its newness will seem less disturbing. But there's also an ideological or even what we might think of an ideologically or morally dubious aspect to this association, isn't there, Wally?
Well, I mean, in putting in the company's full budget, rather than elevating them, denigrating it, meaning that it's only a folk tale. It's only, I mean, Paul Bunyan is all handed down a whole story about Chinatown and Buddhist. And Huck Finn is treated as children's literature, and stories like that must be treated as children's stories. It's not, there's no Tolstoy.
But it's not. But they're not trying to denigrate it, though. I think you're right that there's a special character to the text they choose, and they are, I think, associated. They're supposed to associate it with something like folklore, right? With the storytelling and historical traditions of America. And why is that? Why should that make us nervous? I mean, why is that not simply a benign gesture to make? Why is that not simply something we would say, okay, well, they're just trying to sort of reassure the audience, and there's no problems follow from that?
Well, it's somewhat manipulative because it could be somebody goes to their own bookcase and looks for, their old Amos.
Yeah, maybe that's right, but it's associating the Amos and Andy story with these other. I don't think they're denigrated, Wally, but I think the idea is that they're thought to be deeply embedded in the warp and woof of American culture. They're part of the root system of American culture. Now, maybe you're not picking up on this because many of you don't know about Amos and Andy. But what's the story about Amos and Andy? Do you, it's right. Right, right, right. Here, there's no recognition that there might be racist questions about Huck Finn in this. They're assuming Huck Finn is but your point is exactly right. The fact is, as you'll see in a moment, Amos and Andy relies upon the most shocking kinds of racial stereotypes. And in fact, because of protests from the NAACP, the show was knocked off the air after 2 years. And one of the great ironies is it now is shown on the Black Entertainment Television Network, but in the early days of television, quite rightly, there was outrage about the fact that Amos and Andy was going to be on television. And as you'll see in a moment, the reason has to do with the fact that the characters in Amos and Andy are stereotypes of African Americans that go back to the pre-minstrel days, to the minstrel shows and before, the caricatures of blacks that developed from the days of slavery. And in fact, there's another very important fact about American media embedded in this detail, because Amos and Andy was not a very important television program. It only appeared for a couple of years and it disappeared. Why was it on television at all? Does anyone know where it comes from? It was not only a radio program, it was one of the most popular and defining radio programs of its day. It was created by white men right, they couldn't be on television because you could see that they were white, but they did these black voices, these dialect voices. And one of the important things about Amos and Andy was that it was one of the very first fiction radio programs. And it became a beloved program. Both blacks and whites listened to it. It was one of the most popular shows in the history of radio. It was possible to walk down the streets of American cities in the 30s and 40s during the summer when their windows were open, and you could hear Amos and Andy coming through the windows on every block. It was a cultural phenomenon akin to the most popular television programs of today. And one of the ironies is it was a program as popular with African American audiences as it was with white audiences. Sociologists used to be surprised by that, but of course the explanation was they were the only blacks on the radio, so blacks listened to them even though they were also at some level aware of the stereotype and caricatured qualities in the program. As a cultural phenomenon, Amos and Andy is a very interesting thing because like Birth of a Nation, the founding movie of the first feature film in American society, Amos and Andy could be understood to be the first situation comedy. It establishes the basic formats that later become the organizing expectations, the organizing conventions of American television situation comedy. And one could say in a way that situation comedy originates in radio. And the originating text for situation comedy, one of the dominant forms of popular entertainment in the second half of the 20th century. So one could say that one of the originating texts of situation comedy is this deeply racist article, this deeply racist object. Why is this important? Well, it's a reminder to us that culture is not benign, and the story forms of a culture can carry ideological messages that we might find deeply offensive. That doesn't lessen their importance to us as artifacts for study. Perhaps it even increases them. But it's a way of reminding us that when we look at the story forms, especially the story forms of a popular medium like radio or like television, we're looking at story forms that are going to carry the sicknesses, the prejudices, the moral and cultural and racial and gender stereotypes of a culture, even as they will also carry the virtues and values of the culture that we might not think of as so potentially negative. And Amos and Andy carries all of those elements for us. Now I only have a couple of minutes left, but I'd like to at least begin to show you some of the episode. What we will do, we will continue this discussion next time, and I'll continue showing you this as our way into larger questions having to do with with our project, I'd like to show you a little of the program itself, and you can see how this process of what we might think of it as a process of almost as a process of propaganda, wherein certain assumptions about American life are being suggested to us by the narrative conventions of the program. So I don't want to give a false picture. I don't think that every program is quite so disturbing and in some ways morally pernicious as Amos and Andy, but it's very important to recognize that the founding texts, the originating texts in America's technological media, the technological media of the 20th century, the movies, Birth of a Nation, the radio and television, Amos and Andy, are so revelatory about the racist and, in some degree, as you'll see in other ways, patriarchal underpinnings of the culture out of which they come. This is, I want to be careful about this because I am not myself so obsessed by these ideological or political questions that I want to blind us to other equally interesting, partly aesthetic and humanistic and moral questions. But I don't want us to avoid these issues too. So one of the things we'll be doing as we go on to read American television is we'll be reading the ideological structures that are carried by American television, that are embedded in its story forms. And if you think now, on the basis of what I've already said about what situation comedy is, it will begin to be clear to you what some of you surely already know, that situation comedy is one of the central systems for reminding Americans about what roles belong to women, what roles belong to children, what the function of the family is. It's an ideological machine, right? And therefore, the transformations of situation comedy become culturally and anthropologically profoundly important because they mirror, not exactly in a one-to-one way. Social reality is often far ahead of what is reflected on a conservative medium like television. But nonetheless, what the changes in the way the family or the way the races are represented on American television can have profound importance to us.